So Charles, before we jump into Supercommunicators, one of the things that always interests me is how people decide ultimately to write books. And you're clearly a very accomplished writer. Was writing books something you always wanted to do, or was it?
So I'll be totally honest, why I wrote my first book, The Power of Habit, was, so I went to HBS, and I graduated from HBS, and I had started a company, and I sold that company halfway through HBS, and I decided to become a journalist. And graduated and was the lowest earning member of my class for like the next 7 years, right? Like, had no money whatsoever. And I was working at the New York Times, and my wife got pregnant, and I was like, I gotta get some money, man. Like, I don't know how I'm gonna raise a kid and not have, and so I was like, okay, I need to come up with a book idea. And so how many of you guys have kids? I assume most people don't. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you this crazy idea that we had, which was, my wife's a scientist. I was like, what we'll do is we'll find 12 studies about how to make your life better. And after our son is born, we'll live 1 month apiece for these studies, and then I'll write a book about it.
And your wife killed you.
No, my wife was like, that sounds like a great idea, because we had no idea. Of course, like if I'd known that what like having a kid is like, I would have been like, we'll be brain dead for 12 months after we have our kid. But one of the months was habits. And I mentioned it to an agent, and the agent said, that's a terrible book idea, the 12-month thing, but that habits thing is kind of interesting. And I was like, maybe I can earn enough money to buy a house. And so it all worked out. But it's that was actually the genesis of book writing.
So your books are very different from, has anyone here read any of the articles that he's written? His articles are fascinating. New Yorker, just great things. The most recent one's very interesting. But they're very different than the books. How do you choose what to write in what medium?
So the thing that's interesting, and I imagine this would resonate with a lot of you as readers. The reader brings a subconscious desire to a magazine that's very different from the subconscious to a book. When you read a magazine, a lot of what you're looking for is what's wrong with the world, right? If I write a piece about Trump and how terrible he is, people will eat that up. But if you write a book, people want a book that's about how to make my life better. What's the positive case on things? And so it's really interesting if you look at other writers, Michael Lewis, for instance, who's a friend, the books that do really, really well are the books that tell you how to succeed at life. And Michael's very optimistic. And his books that do less well are books that tell you about the problems, right? The Big Short's a great example of a book that you think is about a problem and is actually about how do we take advantage, how do we understand the system? How do we find the opportunities in something like this? And so that's how I distinguish between books and articles. I will say up till now, a lot of my books have been kind of self-help for the literary set a little bit, right? For the New Yorker set. And I'm now gonna start writing more about, moving away from that and writing about AI is gonna be my next book, if I can figure out what it's actually about. If anyone has any ideas, let me know, because I'm looking for some characters.
Look forward to reading that one. Was there a specific motivation behind Supercommunicators?
Yeah. So I had two things. I had this experience with my wife, and I'm going to say this, and I imagine this is familiar to some of you, I hope. We fell into this pattern where I'd come home. We've been married for 20 years. And I would start complaining about my day, and I'd say, like, my boss doesn't appreciate me, and my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife... I
have that conversation all the time.
All the time. I don't understand. Like, they seem like smart people. Why don't they recognize? And my wife would give me this really good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch, and you guys can get to know each other better. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get upset. I would say, like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. I imagine this is familiar to some of you, right? That, like, usually it's a little reversed. Somebody brings up a problem and you try and solve the problem, and it turns out they're not asking you to solve the problem. And so because this happens so frequently, I was kind of interested. And so I went to these researchers and I asked them, like, why do smart people keep falling into this pattern? And they said, it's actually kind of interesting you showed up, because we are living through the golden age of understanding communication. Because of advances in neural imaging, because of advances in data collection, particularly neural data collection, we can basically see what's happening in people's brains as they're having conversations for the first time. And what we've discovered is this kind of breakdown, which is when you are having a good conversation with someone, when you feel connected to someone, it's reflected in your body and your brain. It's actually a product of your body and your brain. Without you being aware of it, your breath rate starts to match each other. Your heart rate starts to match each other. The dilation of your eyes, even if you're on Zoom and in different rooms, will start to match each other. And even more importantly, what's happening inside your brain, your neural activity, will become more and more similar. And within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment. And there's a guy named Uri Hassan at Princeton who's basically spent his whole career doing this. The more our brains become alike, the better we understand each other. We can literally hear each other more clearly as our brains become aligned. But what's interesting about this is that if I'm having an emotional conversation and I'm using the basal ganglia, the interior structure of my brain, or the amygdala, and you are having a practical conversation and you're using your prefrontal cortex, it is very hard for us to align our neural activity. So it's not so much when you have a great conversation that your body changes because of the conversation. The conversation is great because your body changes. And it turns out from an evolutionary perspective, this is the single most important thing in pro-sociality. When we can align our thinking, we can disagree with each other, we can vote for different people, we can think each other are idiots, but we will feel connected to each other in a way that we can actually have a relationship. And so that's what I became really interested in is, why is this so hard today? Why are we failing at this so much?
And thus the book.
Thus the book. Thus the book, yeah.
Can we level set for everyone? When you talk about supercommunicators, how do you define what a supercommunicator is?
So I'll ask you a question, and all of you, because this is the best way to demonstrate it. If you were having a really bad day, and you came home and you wanted to call someone who you know talking to them would just make you feel better, do you know who you would call? Does that person pop into your mind?
There's a couple people that I would call. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay. So tell me one of them. Just
I call my sister.
Okay, your sister. Your
Right.
sister. And I imagine a number of you have that person in your head, right? Your sister for you is a super communicator, and you are a super communicator back to her. And if I could study your phone calls with your sister, what I would see is a set of skills that both of you are using with each other and not recognizing that they're skills. You know exactly what question to ask her to pull her out. You know when she needs to hear some comfort or when she needs to hear some tough love and a plan. You know how to prove to her that you're listening. And these skills that make you a super communicator to your sister, what we can recognize is that once we recognize them as skills, we realize we can use them with anyone, right? We think that it's something unique to our sisters or to our best friends, but it's like reading. You don't read just to learn one kind of book. You learn how to read. It's fungible. Communication skills are fungible. And when we recognize those skills at the core of being a super communicator, we can become consistent super communicators. And there's a group of people who in the world who do this.
So you talk a little bit, and I can't remember whether this was in the book or some of your interviews, about how super communicators aren't born. You kind of develop into a super communicator. But I mean, you and I talked about this earlier. You know, one of the people who recommended this book club for us is Gary Swart, and the audience got a name check here. Gary, everyone who knows Gary thinks of Gary as a super communicator.
Yeah.
Right? He's these people that are born with the gift of gab.
So, Gary, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I would imagine, if we were to ask Gary, and you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, have you always been a graceful communicator? What you find is that consistent super communicators invariably say no. They say things like, I had trouble making friends in high school and I had to study how kids talk to each other to really figure it out. And then once I figured it out, I understood it. Or my parents got divorced when I was young and I was the peacemaker between them. What we find is that the best communicators are great communicators, not because they're born with something, but because they just think about communication a little bit more, and they're often forced to by life. And that thinking about communication is the thing that makes us a good communicator.
And are you saying that it's like sports? Like Steph Curry was born with amazing talent for basketball, but Steph Curry practices every single day.
Every single day. Every single day. And the truth of the matter is, there's 1,000 Steph Currys in this country who don't practice every day.
Right, and who will never.
And who they have a great high school career, and then now they're selling insurance. You're exactly right. And the thing is, though, that unlike Steph Curry, unlike being born with athletic skill, and I can say this as someone who's born with zero athletic skill, our brains have actually evolved to be good at communication. All of us are born the Steph Curry or one step down of communication. Because literally for the last million years, the most important thing for your success as a species has been being able to collectively plan and link up with other humans. And so as a result, our brains have evolved to be great at communication if we understand how to let them do so. And so we're all Steph Currys.
So following the Steph Curry metaphor, I mean, there's certain, he goes and practices multiple shots on the court. He has very specific things that he practices. Is there a list of very specific things that you would recommend people practice?
Absolutely. So here's a couple of things that it's worth developing habits around. The first is one of the things that we know about consistent supercommunicators, people who do this on a regular basis, is that they tend to ask more questions than the average person, like 10 to 20 times as many questions. And some of those questions you don't even clock as questions because they say things like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or, what happened next? They're basically inviting you into the conversation. But some of the questions that they're asking are what are known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks about your values or your beliefs or your experiences, which can sound super intimidating if I tell you have to do that, except that it's as simple as like, if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Like, why'd you go? Right? That second question, you all know, when you're asked that second question, what you're really asking someone is like, who are you? Who do you care about? Tell me about what your values are. Tell me about what your experiences are. And what happens when we ask a question like that is it triggers what's known as the vulnerability instinct. And we tend to misunderstand what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is something very specific in psychology. When I say something to you that you could judge, it causes me to feel vulnerable. Now, I might not care about your judgment. I might tell you that I think Star Trek is better than Star Wars. And you think I'm an idiot for thinking that. But I don't care, it's not important. But by telling you something you could judge, if you don't judge me, and in fact, if you tell me something I could judge in return, we cannot help but trust each other a little bit more. It's baked into our neurology. It's the social reciprocity that's at the core of prosociality. And so when I ask a deep question, what I'm doing is I'm inviting someone, I'm giving them an opportunity to say something I could judge. And if I withhold that judgment, we like each other more, we trust each other more, we're more persuaded by each other, despite all the things we might have in differences.
So isn't that, I mean, just oversimplifying it, just a high EQ person?
So it's an interesting question because, like, what is EQ, right? I mean, we talk about EQ as if it's this like thing that we can put our finger on, but it's much like IQ. Right. We all know that. I'm sure you see lots of people come through with your firms who are high IQ and don't really do well, and other people who maybe wouldn't score great on the test.
On the spectrum.
Yeah, right. And they just they knock it out of the park. So what is EQ? EQ is a combination of behaviors, of skills. And one of those is this prosociality, is looking for opportunities to connect and then jumping on them, when you see them manifest, saying like, I'm going to step into that opportunity rather than I'm going to sort of shy away from it.
So refining the art of communication is as old as the traveling salesman. I mean, Dale Carnegie and Toastmasters and all this sort of thing. What you started off talking about modern science, psychology. What have we learned from modern sciences that they didn't know, that Dale Carnegie didn't know, that Toastmasters, when they started, weren't able to take advantage of?
So I think the biggest thing is we've learned how to define it much better. So I mentioned this neural entrainment, that we feel closer to people when we entrain with them. What we've discovered is that when you have a conversation, and we can see this in neural imaging, when you have a conversation, you kind of assume you know what the conversation's about, right? Like we're talking about my book, or we're talking about my day, or budgets for next year. But actually, if I was to look at your brain during that conversation, what I would see is you are having many different kinds of conversations at once. And in general, these conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are practical conversations where we're using our prefrontal cortex and we're making plans or we're solving problems. And then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. I want you to use your amygdala and your basal ganglia. I want you to connect with me. And then there's social conversations, which is actually the largest kind of the largest neural network, which is about how we relate to each other, how we sort of think about hierarchies, how we relate to society, the identities that are important to us, how we see ourselves. And what we now know that I think a lot of these guys kind of intuitively knew is if you're matching the other person, if you say something that indicates that you're in an emotional mindset, and I'm willing to match you there, then we will start hearing each other with more fidelity. And
create a connection.
We'll create a connection. And once we're aligned, we can move from conversation to conversation together. So, and again, this can sound like kind of an intimidating thing, but I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and we were waiting for it to start. We were sitting at a conference table, and the guy next to me, I said, like, oh, how was your weekend? And he said, oh, it was great, man. I went to my kid's graduation. It was just amazing. And it would have been the easiest thing on earth to say, oh, congratulations, that's just awesome. That's really fantastic. Okay, here's the agenda. Let's get down to business. But instead, what I said was, in my head, I said, look, it seems like you just used an emotional word. You were talking about how it felt. And so I said to him, I was just like, that's amazing, congratulations. What did it feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage? Because my kids are growing up and I'm kind of worried about like when they leave home. And the guy, he only responded for 4 or 5 minutes. He told me what he felt. And at that moment, we were in sync. And for the rest of the meeting, we were in sync. When we went onto the agenda, when we went onto the budget. And that's, I think, the thing that's important, is looking for those opportunities.
I find a lot of times professionally, when entrepreneurs come in and pitch us, you start a little bit with the, tell me about yourself kind of thing. But even small talk, tell me about yourself. And it's that sort of connecting. It's like understanding who you are, drawing a connection, and then jumping into whatever it is that you're going to tell
And
me.
do you find when that happens, when they come in and they're pitching you, and you're also kind of pitching them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I start off those conversations to create that connection. Right. Because, if I'm pitching them, the best way to get someone to want to work with you is for them to like you. You want to establish a rapport with this person. So
absolutely, and it's a good way to figure out sort of what again the EQ of this person is. So one thing I was talking to he was a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, and I was asking him like, what's the question that you ask candidates to decide if you want to hire like a C-level officer? And he said, actually, they're like, by the time they make it to me, like they've been vetted 30 ways to Sunday. So usually what I do is I say something kind of revealing, like I talk about when my dad died, and I see how they react. Because the way that most people react in a situation like that is they say something like, oh, my condolences, I'm so sorry. And then they stop. But the best ones go, oh, my condolences, I'm so sorry. Like, what was your dad like? Mm-hmm. And anyone who's lost a parent, you love it when people, like, all you want to do is talk about how much you loved this person. And for someone to step into that intimacy, I think it tells you so much about who they are.
And what kind of a leader maybe they'll be.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So we talked a little bit about kinds of conversations. When you are starting this conversation, what's the best way to figure out which kind of conversation are we having here?
So asking those deep questions I'll tell you what they teach in schools. They teach teachers that if a student comes up to you and they want to have a serious conversation, you should ask them start the conversation by saying, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? And if you have young kids at home, it's worth trying this with them, because what you'll find is they will absolutely answer that question immediately. They know exactly what they want out of the conversation.
Do most adults answer that question?
Well, now the thing is, if you do that at work, if you're like, you want to be hugged, you're going to get HR called, right? It's not going to work out. It's not going to work out. Yeah. So we got to adjust it a little bit for the workplace. And I think at that point, that's when you ask this deep question. When you ask someone, why'd you go to medical school? They're going to answer that one of two ways, and the same person might answer these two ways. Some if they're in a practical mindset, they might say, hey, I wanted a steady job, or I was really interested in medicine. I just thought it would be great to I really love science. Okay, this is a person in a practical mindset. But if they say something like, oh, I saw my dad get sick when I was a kid, and I wanted to be one of those people. I wanted to be a healer. So they're an emotional mindset, maybe a social mindset. When we ask that deep question, What we're doing is we're actually saying to someone, tell me who you are, and a subset of that is, what do you want out of this conversation? Because we all come into conversations wanting something out of it. Sometimes it's just for the conversation to be graceful and sort of be able to make small talk. But when we invite someone to tell us what they want, the odds of that conversation going well go up.
So I years ago went to a speech with Bill Clinton in a room of 50 people, and it felt like he was talking right to you. Is there anything that you learned in your research that would sort of tell you how somebody does that?
Yeah.
What makes somebody that kind of super communicator?
Tonight's the State of the Union, so we're gonna has anyone been to a Trump rally? Anyone in the room?
Is anyone?
Okay. I love San Francisco. I gotta say, my people. So I've been to a number.
Yeah, it's a trick question. Yeah. You raise your hand right there, Michael. Go for it, buddy.
I've been to a number of Trump rallies as a reporter, and I've spent some time, one-on-one with Trump and sort of in a room. And I hate to say this because I really dislike the guy really deeply. Trump is like a super communicator par extraordinaire, right? That is why this guy's gotten elected. Yeah. If you go to a rally, here's what you see. You see him up on the stage, and he just starts saying like random shit, right? Like whatever is coming to mind. But the whole time, he's listening really closely to the audience, and when the audience reacts, he leans into it. And what he's doing in that moment is he's proving that he's listening. He's proving to you that he's paying attention. And this is something that supercommunicators one-on-one do too, right? There's actually a technique known as looping for understanding about how to do this. And if you watch what he does, the reason he has this magic, unfortunately for the United States, is that he proves to you that he's listening. It feels like a conversation. And I think it's true of Clinton too, right? Like, you feel like he's saying things that are inside your head, and then you feel like he sees you saying them, agreeing with him.
And Obama was the same.
Obama was the same way,
yeah.
Right?
Biden, Bush went out.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and yeah. Biden we could talk about for a long time as an anti-super communicator, but these are absolutely, again, it's just a set of skills. Again, and that's because our species needs these skills. Our species has relied on these skills in order to form villages and then communities and towns and now communities like this. And as we recognize them as skills, it means we can practice them. We can make them into habits, and we can use them with one person or with our kids or with the crowd.
Do you think you're a better communicator for having written the book?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think I am. And I think, how many of you have teenagers?
Thank God, no.
Okay. So those of you, my fellow travelers, it's hard to have, the problem with, I didn't realize this until I had a teenager myself. It's really hard to make that transition from being like a parent of a young child who wants to follow your advice all the time to suddenly being someone who they inherently distrust because you can't possibly know anything about their life. And you actually want to have this relationship as a peer with them, right? You want to,
That'll develop over time.
That's what I'm hoping. That's it. But it's a transition, and I feel like for a long time my kids would come to me with a problem when they were young, and I thought my job was to solve the problem, which is probably true for a lot of your CEOs, right? That we get into this place where we think, I'm the CEO, or I'm the parent, or I'm the leader in this community, and if someone comes to me with a problem, it's my job to solve the problem. And the thing that this has really helped me do is to take a step and say, either to ask them or just try and look for clues. Are you actually looking for me to solve this problem, have a practical conversation, or are you just trying to share something with me? Do you want me just to empathize and say, oh man, that sounds rough. I'm sorry that happened to you. Because we all know what that feels like, right? It feels amazing.
I think generally by the time they're talking to me as the investor and board member, there's some level of practical conversation there. You will get into the emotional conversation as well, but there's almost always I have an end goal, but this is really hard.
That's interesting. And are they looking for you to give them practical advice, or are they looking for you to level set and say, it's okay to feel this way?
I would say definitely, it depends on the conversation. I definitely have done both. I mean, it's okay to feel this way. Like, one of the things about doing startups is it's up and down. And when it's down, I always told, I started 3 companies, and I always found it was easier to have a co-founder. And one of the reasons it's easier to have a co-founder is because things are never as bad as you think they are at the worst point, and they're never going to be as good as you think they are at the high point. Now, is that really true? Because, at the low point, oh my God, this is going to fail. Yes, that happens. But it's going to fail. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to be shunned from polite society and this sort of thing. No, that's actually probably not going to happen. It's just going to fail, and then you're going to move on to the next thing. So having been through that and lived that firsthand, I absolutely am able to have that conversation with an entrepreneur and say, hey, it's hard, and it's not you. It's not you. It's me. It's not you. It's the market. It's not you. It's this. Don't worry. You're gonna survive to fight another day.
And when we do that, it, like, to the person receiving and to the giver, it feels amazing, right? And so what's interesting is, in that moment when you're having that conversation, if I could look inside your brains, what I would see is this neural entrainment. And our brains are actually predisposed to basically release a huge reward sensation when we have neural entrainment, because our evolution kind of wants to push us towards prosociality. And so what's interesting is that by saying this to this person, but just saying, like, it's going to be okay. Like, I've been through this. I know that I know it's hard, and it should be hard. Right. Like, you actually have a biochemical reaction that actually makes it easier to deal with that pain.
Well, and sometimes for the entrepreneurs, if a company's failing and it's going to fail, obviously it's just helpful to have one of the people who invested in you and everything else say, you know what, you're gonna live to fight another day. You're gonna be fine.
Yeah,
right.
That's absolutely true.
So mediums of communication change all the time. Obviously, the world now with digital communication, very different from sitting down in front of someone. Are there things that supercommunicators that you think they do in a digital realm, communicating in a digital realm, that makes them better? I mean, it's when you're on Zoom is one thing, when I'm via text, it's another. I learned early in my professional career that sending emails to someone when you're pissed off actually is not a good thing to do.
That sounds like a hard-learned lesson.
Yeah, hard-learned lesson in my early 20s. It's like, no, actually, so.
It's better. Yeah, so you actually hit on what we know digital supercommunicators do so well, which is that they remember that different channels and different kinds of communication require different things. And there's actually a great example of this about telephones. So 100 years ago, when phones first became popular, and San Francisco was actually one of the hotbeds of it relatively early, there were all these articles that appeared that said, no one will ever have a real conversation on the phone. Because up till then, all conversations had happened face to face, right? Sometimes over letters, but they basically said, look, and remember, the fidelity wasn't real high. They said, look, if you can't see the person and see their expressions, if you can't hear the tone of their voice, you're never going to have a real conversation. And what's fascinating is they were right. For the next 15 years, if you look at transcripts of early conversations, because a lot of them were collected, people had no idea how to use telephones. They would use them as telegraphs. You would call up your grocer and you would put in your order and he would say, thank you, do you need anything else? And you'd say no and hang up the phone. Like, there was no concept that we could have a back and forth. And then something happened, right? And by the time all of us are in middle school, we can have conversations for 7 hours a night. And they seem like the most important conversations of our life, right? We know how to have conversations on phones. So what changed? What changed, of course, is that you learned how to use phones. And we learned it without even realizing we were learning it. And even now, when you're on a telephone, you on average will over-enunciate your words by about 30%. You'll put about 20% more emotion into your voice. You aren't aware that you're doing this. You don't do it on purpose. You do it because subconsciously you know this person can't see me. I know how to communicate on a phone. I do certain things. Which brings us to digital communication, right? All of you with kids, if you dare, ask them to show you their text messages. Again, not for the faint of heart. But what you'll see is that there will be these periods when they are texting each other strings of emojis. They are having emotional conversations over texts. They have learned how to have an emotional conversation over text. We don't know how to do that because we don't practice it. So the people who are really great digital communicators are the people who sit down before they send a text or before they send an email, and they say, an email is different from a text, is different from a face-to-face conversation, is different from a phone call. I can be sarcastic if we're talking on the phone. I can't be sarcastic if we're emailing. If I'm upset, I should go find the person instead of emailing them. We're learning these lessons. We're learning them slower than our kids. But the key to being good at it is just to remember it's worth taking that half second to remind yourself of what the rules are of this particular form of communication.
Your telephone example is funny because the hang up right away. I had a great uncle who died 10 years ago at 104 or something. And whenever I didn't talk to him much on the phone, but when I talked to him on the phone, it was this no, okay, bye, okay, thanks, bye. Yeah. It's like, you're done, click. Yeah. It was like the phone was gone.
It was not, my dad was born in 1929. He passed away about 7 years ago. And the man could not he was a lawyer. He talked on the phone all day long. Literally could not end a conversation on the phone like in a natural way. But it's
a natural to us.
Yeah, natural to us.
Right.
Very
exactly.
natural to him. Yeah.
Right. Right. Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.